The knife was already at his throat when Joseph heard the child scream, and in that split second he had to choose between his own survival and something he thought he had lost years ago in the blood-soaked mud of the outer colonies. The blade pressed harder, drawing a thin line of crimson, and somewhere in the fog a little girl with blue skin was crying for her dying mother while soldiers closed in from all sides. This was the moment everything changed. The silence of the jungle had been almost absolute before that scream tore through it like a jagged knife through silk. It was not the call of any bird Joseph had cataloged in his 3 years on this forsaken planet, nor was it the territorial roar of the six-legged predators that prowled the canopy at night. This was something else entirely, something that made his combat instincts fire in rapid succession like warning flares in his nervous system. His hand moved to the handle of his knife before his conscious mind had even processed the sound. Fingers wrapping around the worn leather grip with the automatic precision of a man who had survived too many ambushes to count. Every fiber of his being screamed the same message that had kept him alive through countless firefights and desperate retreats. Do not interfere. Do not break cover. Do not compromise your position for an unknown contact in hostile territory. The rules were simple, and they were written in the blood of men who had ignored them. Joseph had seen good soldiers die because they heard a cry for help and forgot that mercy was a luxury you could not afford when you were already marked for execution. But his legs had other ideas, and they were already changing direction before he could countermand them. Something in that scream had bypassed his tactical training and spoken directly to a part of him he thought had died somewhere between his 4th and 5th tour of duty. Perhaps it was the pitch, high and desperate, and utterly terrified in a way that transcended species. Or perhaps it was simply that he had been running for so long that he had forgotten what it meant to run towards something instead of away from it. Joseph moved through the dense jungle wall with the fluid grace of a man who had learned to read terrain the way other men read books. He did not walk so much as flow between the massive trunks of the blue-bark trees, his body automatically adjusting to the uneven ground beneath his feet, while his eyes scanned for the telltale signs of tripwires and pressure plates. The colonial militia had seeded these jungles with enough improvised explosive devices to keep the local population in a state of permanent terror, and Oswin's hunting parties had added their own lethal contributions to the landscape. His camouflage fatigues were soaked through with condensation from the oppressive humidity that hung over everything like a wet blanket. Sweat ran down his spine in rivulets, but his breathing remained even and measured, barely, audible even to his own ears. 3 years of living like a ghost in these endless green corridors had taught him to move with a silence that bordered on the supernatural. The local RI hunters said he walked like a spirit, and Joseph had learned to take that as a compliment rather than an accusation. He stopped beside an ancient tree whose trunk was wider than 3 men, standing shoulder to shoulder, pressing his palm against the thick moss that coated its bark like velvet. The ground beneath his feet was vibrating with a rhythm he recognized all too well. Heavy boots, at least 4 sets of them, moving in a standard patrol pattern through the underbrush. Step, pause, scan, step, pause, scan. The eternal dance of men who knew they were hunting prey that could think and plan and kill. Joseph counted the intervals between footfalls, building a mental map of their positions and likely trajectories. They were moving fast, faster than a standard patrol, which meant they were tracking something specific, or someone. His jaw tightened as he calculated distances and angles, weighing his options with the cold precision of a man who had learned that hesitation killed you just as surely as a bullet. From the milky fog that filled the spaces between the trees like liquid cotton, a small figure suddenly burst into view. The child moved with the uncoordinated panic of someone who had pushed their small body beyond its limits, stumbling over roots and nearly falling twice before she managed to correct her balance. Joseph's hand was already bringing up his knife in a defensive posture when his eyes finally processed what he was seeing. This was Lindali, though he would not learn her name until later. She was perhaps 5 years old by human standards, though Joseph had learned that judging the age of the RI was more art than science. Her skin was the deep indigo of the evening sky just after sunset, marked with the faint bioluminescent patterns that all her people bore. Her eyes were huge in her small face, easily 3 times the size of human eyes, and they were filled with such raw terror that Joseph felt something twist painfully in his chest. The child saw him, and her first instinct was pure prey response. She recoiled violently, throwing her small arms up over her head in a defensive posture that spoke of hard experience with human violence. Her 4-fingered hands were trembling so hard he could see it from 3 meters away. But then something changed in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or simply the desperate calculation of someone who had run out of options. She was looking at his clothes, he realized, looking at the way his uniform had been stripped of all insignia and unit patches, the way he carried his weapons like tools rather than symbols of authority. She was seeing that he was not one of them, not anymore. Lindley rushed forward with the desperate speed of a drowning swimmer, reaching for a rope, her small hands grabbing at the rough fabric of his pants with surprising strength. Her fingers were coated with dried mud and what looked like blood, and when they closed around his wrist, they dug in with such intensity that Joseph knew she would leave bruises. She was trying to speak, her small mouth forming words in the clicking, musical language of her people, before switching abruptly to broken human speech. Her voice was hoarse from crying or screaming or both, but he could make out the words between her desperate sobs. "Please, Mom! Trap! Hurt bad! Bleeding! Please, please, please!" The child was begging him in the language of her mother's killers, and Joseph felt something cold and sharp lodge itself in his throat. She was pulling at him now, her small body straining with effort as she tried to physically drag him in the direction she had come from. Back toward the patrol, back toward danger, back toward everything his training told him to avoid. Lindley would not release his wrist, her fingers digging in with a grip born of absolute desperation. She was speaking rapidly now, switching between languages in her panic, and though Joseph could not understand most of the words, he understood the meaning perfectly. Her mother was dying, and she needed help, and he was the only chance she had left in this entire hostile world. Joseph stood frozen for a moment that stretched like taffy, pulled between the iron logic of self-preservation and something else that he had thought was buried deep enough that it could never trouble him again. The smart play was obvious. You did not follow unknown contacts into potential ambushes. You did not risk your life for strangers. You did not let emotional appeals override tactical assessment. These were the rules that kept you alive, and he had followed them religiously for 3 years. But he was looking into those huge alien eyes and seeing something that transcended tactics and protocols in the cold mathematics of survival. He was seeing a child who had just watched her mother step into a trap and who had made the desperate choice to run toward the most dangerous thing she could imagine because it was the only hope she had left. Joseph felt his resolve crumble like a dam giving way to floodwater. His jaw set in a hard line, and he gave a single sharp nod. "Lead the way," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. The girl's face transformed in an instant, terror giving way to desperate hope. She turned and began running back the way she had come, and Joseph followed, his body dropping into a low combat crouch as he moved. He kept one hand on his rifle to prevent it from bouncing and creating noise, while the other swept aside branches and vines before they could slap into the child's face. They were moving fast now, too fast for proper caution, but Joseph could hear the patrol behind them, and he knew they were running out of time. Lindley ran with the single-minded determination of a child who had found hope and would not let it go. Her small legs pumping furiously as she navigated the treacherous terrain with the instinctive skill of someone who had grown up in these jungles. Joseph's mind was already racing ahead, calculating scenarios and outcomes. The patrol was close enough that he could hear individual voices now through the background noise of the jungle. He recognized one of them, a sergeant named Marcus who had the unpleasant habit of collecting trophies from his kills. If they caught him here, helping one of the locals, there would be no trial and no questions. Just a bullet in the back of the head and a shallow grave that the jungle would reclaim in a matter of weeks. But he kept running, following the small blue figure ahead of him, and some part of his mind noted with dark humor that after 3 years of successfully staying alive through caution and paranoia, He was about to get himself killed over a stranger's scream. They burst through a final curtain of hanging vines and into a small clearing that was carpeted with soft moss and fallen leaves. Joseph's eyes swept the space in an automatic tactical assessment, noting sight lines and cover positions and escape routes, before finally settling on the figure that lay crumpled on the far side of the clearing. Medema lay on her side in a spreading pool of her own blood, her pale blue skin looking almost gray in the filtered light that made it through the canopy. Her face was contorted in an expression of such pure agony that Joseph felt his stomach clench in sympathy. She was trying desperately not to make noise, one hand pressed over her mouth to muffle the sounds that wanted to escape, but he could see the way her chest was heaving with the effort of breathing through the pain. Her right leg was caught in a trap, and Joseph felt ice water flood his veins as he recognized the device. This was a Bear 7, an anti-personnel trap that had been designed by some sadist in a military laboratory somewhere to cause maximum damage while keeping the victim alive and conscious long enough to serve as bait for rescue attempts. The steel jaws had closed around her leg just above the ankle with such force that he could see white bone gleaming through the torn flesh. The trap's serrated teeth had been designed to punch through Kevlar and ballistic fabric, and they had gone through Madama's leg like it was paper. Blood was pumping out in steady spurts that told him an artery had been severed. She had minutes, not hours, maybe less. Joseph was already moving before he finished processing the information, his training taking over and pushing aside the useless emotional responses. He crossed the clearing in 3 long strides and dropped to his knees beside the injured woman, his hands already reaching for the emergency medical kit on his belt. Medema saw him coming and tried desperately to pull away, her eyes going wide with renewed terror. She saw the human uniform and the weapons, and all she knew was that one of them had finally come to finish what the trap had started. She tried to push herself backward with her good leg, but the movement sent fresh agony lancing through her trapped limb, and she could not suppress the scream that tore free from her throat. "Do not move!" Joseph snapped, his voice carrying the tone of absolute command that he had learned in basic training a lifetime ago. "You move that leg and you will bleed out in 90 seconds. Something in his voice or his manner must have penetrated her panic because Medema went still, though he could see the way her whole body was trembling with the effort of holding herself motionless. Her eyes were locked on his face with the intensity of a prey animal, watching a predator, waiting to see if he was going to kill her or walk away and let the trap do it for him. Joseph ignored her stare and focused on the trap, his trained eyes taking in every detail of its construction. The Bear 7 was a masterpiece of brutal efficiency, double spring mechanism with enough force to snap a human femur like a twig. Motion sensor array that made it almost impossible to approach safely. Reverse lock that prevented the jaws from opening once they had closed on a target. The teeth were coated with some kind of polymer that was probably laced with coagulant inhibitors to make sure any wound bled freely. This was not designed to catch animals. This was designed to catch and cripple sentient beings, to leave them alive and screaming so that their friends and family would come running into the kill zone. Joseph had seen these traps before, had seen the kind of carnage they could inflict, and he knew exactly whose signature was all over this particular setup. Oswin. The name echoed in his head like a curse. Captain Oswin, his former commanding officer, and the closest thing to a friend he had ever had in the service. The man who had taught him how to read terrain and plan ambushes and survive against impossible odds. The man who had also taught him that mercy was weakness and that the only good alien was a dead one. Joseph had thought he was done with that life, thought he could simply walk away and disappear into the endless green maze of the jungle and never have to confront what he had become. But Oswin had a way of finding you no matter how deep you buried yourself. And here was the proof of it staring him in the face. He tore his eyes away from the trap and looked at Medema properly for the first time. She was older than Lindali, but still young by the standards of her people. Probably the equivalent of mid-20s in human terms. Her features were fine and delicate, almost fragile looking, but there was steel in her eyes that spoke of someone who had endured more than her share of hardship. The bioluminescent patterns on her skin were flickering weakly in time with her racing heartbeat. "I am going to get you out of this," Joseph said, speaking slowly and clearly. "But I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Medema stared at him. For a long moment, her large eyes searching his face for something. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. Joseph took a deep breath and turned his attention back to the trap. His rifle was useless here. The mechanism was too complex and too robust to simply shoot it apart without risking further injury to the trapped leg. His knife was equally useless. He needed leverage, and he needed it now. His eyes swept the clearing desperately, looking for anything he could use. There, half buried in the moss and detritus of the forest floor, was a length of rusty rebar that had probably been part of the pre-colony infrastructure before the jungle had reclaimed it. It was not ideal, but it would have to do. Joseph grabbed the metal bar and hefted it, testing its weight and balance. It was solid, heavy enough to provide the leverage he needed if he could find the right angle. He moved back to the trap and began probing for a weakness in its construction, looking for the point where he could apply maximum force with minimum risk. "This is going to hurt," he said quietly, not looking at Medema. "There is no way around that. But if you can stay still and stay quiet, we might both live through this." He found the spot he was looking for, a narrow gap between the two curved arms of the trap where the spring mechanism connected to the jaw assembly. If he could get his improvised lever in there and apply enough force, he might be able to force the lock to disengage. It was going to take everything he had and then some. "Lindali," he called out, his voice sharp, "come here and hold your mother's head. Keep her from moving no matter what happens." The little girl rushed forward and dropped to her knees beside her mother's head, her small hands cradling the larger woman's face with surprising gentleness. She was speaking softly in their own language, words that Joseph could not understand but whose meaning was universal. She was telling her mother that everything would be okay, that help had come, that they would survive this. Joseph hoped desperately that she was right. He jammed the rebar into the gap between the trap's arms, forcing it deeper until he felt it catch on something solid. Then he positioned himself carefully, planting his feet and adjusting his grip until he had the maximum possible leverage. His shoulders were already screaming in protest from carrying Medema earlier, and his hands were still bleeding from a dozen small cuts he had acquired on the journey here. But none of that mattered now. He began to push. The metal of the trap resisted with the stubborn immobility of something that had been designed to never let go. Joseph's muscles bunched and strained as he threw all his weight onto the lever, feeling the rough metal digging into his palms even through his gloves. Sweat poured down his face and stung his eyes, but he did not dare move to wipe it away. "Come on," he growled through clenched teeth. "Come on, you piece of junk." The lever was bending under the strain, the soft iron beginning to deform from the incredible forces being applied to it. Joseph felt something give way in his back with a sharp twinge of pain, but he kept pushing, kept pouring everything he had into this single desperate effort. His vision was starting to narrow into a dark tunnel, and he could hear his pulse thundering in his ears like war drums. And then, with a sound like a gunshot, something inside the trap's mechanism gave way. The jaws sprang open so suddenly that Joseph nearly fell forward onto his face, barely catching himself at the last second. He threw the bloodied lever aside and turned to Medema, his hands already moving with the practiced efficiency of field medicine. The trap had done horrific damage to her leg. The flesh was torn and mangled, exposing muscle and tendon in the pale bone beneath. Blood was still pumping from the severed artery with a steady rhythm that told him she had very little time. He grabbed his medical kit and tore it open with shaking fingers, grabbing for the hemostatic powder and the emergency tourniquet that he had prayed he would never have to use. Working with desperate speed, Joseph packed the wound with the clotting powder, watching as it foamed and expanded to fill the torn tissue. The bleeding slowed but did not stop completely. He wrapped the tourniquet around her thigh and pulled it tight, twisting the windlass until the blood flow finally ceased. Medema's face had gone gray and her eyes were rolling back in her head, but she was still breathing, and that was all that mattered. "Stay with me," Joseph said urgently, patting her cheek to keep her conscious. "You are not allowed to die here. Do you understand me? Not after I just went through all that." Medema's eyes focused on his face with obvious effort. Her lips moved and at first no sound came out, but then she managed to whisper something in broken human speech. "Why?" she asked. "Why help us?" Joseph opened his mouth to answer and then closed it again because he did not have a good answer. Why had he helped them? Why had he risked everything to save two strangers who had every reason to fear and hate him? The tactical part of his brain told him it was insanity, but the rest of him knew it was something else entirely. Because someone had to, he said finally. He checked his watch and did some quick mental math that made his stomach sink. The patrol was maybe 5 minutes behind them, possibly less if they had heard Medima scream. They could not stay here. They had to move, and they had to move now. But before they could go anywhere, Joseph needed to check something. He stood and began moving around the perimeter of the clearing, his eyes scanning the ground and the surrounding vegetation with the intensity of a man looking for evidence. He found it almost immediately. Fresh marks on a tree trunk at a shoulder height, deep gouges in the wood that formed a distinctive pattern. Joseph had seen that pattern before, had watched Oswin carve it into trees and walls and the bodies of his enemies. It was a territorial marker, a warning to anyone who might be thinking about crossing him. Joseph felt his blood run cold as he knelt and examined the ground more closely. There, pressed into the soft earth beside the tree, was a clear boot print. Size 45, heavy tread with a herringbone pattern. Standard issue military boot, the kind that Oswin and his men wore. The print was fresh, probably made within the last hour or two. But it was what he found next that made Joseph's hands clench into fists so tight his nails drew blood from his palms. Caught on a thorny branch just above head height was a scrap of fabric, gray synthetic material with a distinctive weave. It was the same material used in the uniforms of Oswin's personal hunting squad, the elite group of killers that he had assembled from the worst psychopaths and sadists in the colonial militia. Joseph held the fabric scrap in his hand and felt a rage unlike anything he had experienced in years. This was not just a random trap. This was deliberate. This was Oswin sending him a message, telling him that no matter how far he ran or how deep he hid, there was nowhere in this jungle that he could go where Oswin could not find him. "He is here," Joseph whispered to himself, the words tasting like poison on his tongue. "That son of a bitch is actually hunting me." He should have known this moment would come, should have known that Oswin would never let him simply walk away from the unit, would never forgive what he would see as the ultimate betrayal. They had been brothers once, or as close to brothers as two men could be in the brutal world of colonial warfare. They had saved each other's lives more times than either could count. But that was before Joseph had seen what Oswin was becoming, before he had watched his friend transform from a soldier into something darker and more terrible, before he had seen Oswin execute a prisoner in cold blood for the crime of being in love with a human woman. Joseph closed his eyes and took a deep breath, forcing the memories back down where they belonged. He could not afford to be distracted by the past, not when the present was trying so hard to kill him. He turned back to Medima and Lindali, his face set in hard lines. "We are leaving," he said flatly. "Right now. Can you walk?" Medima tried to push herself up onto her good leg, but the moment she put any weight on the injured limb, she collapsed with a strangled cry of pain. The tourniquet had stopped the bleeding, but the damage to her leg was too severe for her to support her own weight. Joseph did not hesitate. He moved to her side and carefully positioned himself, then lifted her up in his arms with a grunt of effort. She was lighter than a human woman would have been, but after everything he had already been through today, his muscles were trembling with exhaustion. He could feel his legs, threatening to give out beneath him. "Hold on to me," he told Lindali. "We have a long way to go." The rain that had been threatening all morning finally broke free from the heavy clouds, falling in sheets that reduced visibility to almost nothing. Joseph trudged forward with Medima cradled in his arms, each step requiring a conscious effort of will. His boots were slipping on the muddy slopes, threatening to send all three of them tumbling down into the ravines that crisscrossed this part of the jungle. Lindali clung to his belt with both hands, her small body pressed against his leg as she fought to keep up with his longer strides. She fell twice in the first 100 meters, scraping her knees and palms on the rough ground. But she did not cry out and she did not complain. She simply got back up and kept moving, and Joseph felt a fierce respect for this tiny creature who had more courage than soldiers twice her size. The rain was both blessing and curse. It would make tracking them more difficult, washing away their scent and obscuring their trail, but it also made travel dangerous and exhausting. The slopes became rivers of mud that grabbed at their feet and tried to pull them down. Visibility dropped to mere meters, forcing Joseph to navigate by memory and instinct rather than sight. His arms were burning with the effort of carrying Madima, the muscles in his shoulders and back screaming in protest. She had lost consciousness again, her head lolling against his chest with each step. He could feel her shallow breathing and the faint flutter of her pulse against his arm, and he knew she was in serious trouble. The makeshift tourniquet would keep her alive for now, but infection was almost certain, and she would need real medical attention soon or risk losing the leg entirely. They had been walking for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 40 minutes when Lindley tugged urgently on his belt. Joseph stopped and looked down at her, his chest heaving with exertion. The little girl was pointing up the slope toward a darker shadow in the rock face that might have been a cave or might have been just a trick of the light. "Shelter?" Joseph asked, and Lindley nodded vigorously. Getting to the cave required climbing a nearly vertical section of rock face that was slick with rain and moss. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a challenging but manageable climb. With an unconscious woman in his arms and a child clinging to him, it became an exercise in controlled desperation. Joseph wedged his fingers into cracks in the stone and pulled himself upward one agonizing inch at a time. His boots scrabbled for purchase on the wet rock, sliding and skidding, but somehow always finding just enough friction to keep him from falling. Below him, Lindley was making her own way up with the natural agility of her kind, her four-fingered hands finding holds that Joseph could not even see. Once, his grip failed, and he began to slide backward, Madima's weight pulling him down toward what would certainly be a fatal fall. He threw out his hand desperately and caught a root that was growing from a crack in the stone, his fingers closing around it with such force that he felt something tear in his palm. The root held, barely, and he was able to drag himself and his burden back up to relative safety. When they finally reached the mouth of the cave, Joseph's arms were shaking so badly he could barely control them. He carried Madima inside and laid her down gently on the dry sand that covered the cave floor, then collapsed beside her with a groan that came from somewhere deep in his bones. For several minutes he simply lay there, listening to the sound of rain hammering against the rocks outside and trying to remember how to breathe without his lungs burning. Every muscle in his body was screaming. His hands were raw and bleeding. His back felt like someone had driven hot nails into his spine, and his legs were trembling with exhaustion that went beyond the merely physical. But they were alive. Against all odds and in defiance of every tactical principle he had ever learned, they were still alive. Joseph forced himself to sit up and check on Madima. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her skin cool and clammy to the touch. Signs of shock, probably compounded by blood loss and the onset of infection. He needed to keep her warm and get fluids into her somehow, but their options were severely limited. Lindley curled up against her mother's side, trying to share what little body heat she had. The little girl was shivering from cold and fear and exhaustion, but she kept stroking her mother's hair and whispering to her in their musical language. Joseph could not understand the words, but he recognized the tone. She was telling her mother stories, probably the same stories that Madima had told her when she was even smaller. The rain continued to fall outside, a constant roar that was oddly soothing in its monotony. Joseph sat with his back against the cave wall, his rifle across his knees, and kept watch on the entrance. His eyes were gritty with exhaustion, and his body was begging him to sleep, but he knew that sleep was not an option. Not yet, maybe not ever again. It was perhaps an hour later when Madima's eyes fluttered open. She looked around in confusion for a moment before her gaze settled on Joseph. Recognition dawned slowly, followed by something that might have been gratitude or might have been simple resignation. "Where?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Cave," Joseph replied. "About 3 kilometers from where we started. Maybe 4. Hard to say in this weather." Madima nodded weakly and closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, they had lost some of their cloudiness. She was focusing better, which Joseph took as a good sign. "You should have left us," she said quietly. "Should have saved yourself." "Probably," Joseph agreed, but I have never been very good at doing what I should. A ghost of a smile touched Medima's lips. There and gone so quickly he almost missed it. She shifted slightly, trying to find a more comfortable position, and gasped as pain lanced through her injured leg. Joseph reached out instinctively to steady her, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "Try not to move," he said. "That tourniquet is the only thing keeping you alive right now, but it is also cutting off circulation to your leg. You have maybe 6 hours before permanent damage sets in. We need to get you to real medical help before then." "There is no help," Medima said flatly. "Not for us, not from humans." Joseph started to argue, then stopped because he knew she was right. The colonial medical facilities would not treat RI unless they were prisoners being interrogated, and even then only to keep them alive long enough to extract information. The free clinics that had operated in the early days of the colony were all gone now, shut down by military decree after Oswin had declared the RI to be enemy combatants. "Then where?" Joseph asked. "There must be somewhere we can go, somewhere safe." Medima was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant. Then she looked at him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "There is a place," she said slowly, "in the mountains, beyond the mist valleys, a settlement of my people who have escaped the hunting parties. They have healers there, real healers who know the old ways. But it is far, very far, and the path is dangerous even for those who are whole and strong." "How far?" Joseph pressed. 2 days' travel for someone moving fast and light, maybe 3 for... She gestured weakly at her injured leg. Joseph did the math in his head and did not like the answer. 3 days was too long. She would be dead from infection or blood loss long before they reached this mysterious settlement. Unless... "What if we push straight through?" he asked. "No stops except what is absolutely necessary. Could we make it in 1 day?" "You cannot carry me for a full day," Medima said simply. "No one could. You would collapse before we were halfway there." She was probably right, but Joseph had learned a long time ago that the human body could push far beyond what seemed possible when properly motivated. Fear, adrenaline, and sheer bloody-minded stubbornness could carry you through situations that should by all rights kill you. He had done it before, and he could do it again, assuming he did not die from a bullet in the back first. "My husband was human," Madama said suddenly, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. "Did you know that?" Joseph shook his head, surprised by this revelation. "His name was David," she continued, her voice taking on a distant quality as she retreated into memory. "He was a surveyor, one of the first to arrive when the colony was still new, and everyone still believed we could all live together in peace. He was kind, gentle. He saw me not as an alien or an enemy, but simply as a person." She paused, swallowing hard against the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "We fell in love. It was forbidden, of course. Both our peoples had rules against such things, but we did not care. We were young and foolish, and we believed that love could overcome anything." Lindley had stopped her gentle stroking and was now watching her mother with huge eyes, clearly hearing this story for the first time, or perhaps the 100th. It was impossible to tell. "We had 10 years together," Medima said softly. 10 years of hiding and running and stealing moments of happiness wherever we could find them. And then Lindley was born, and for a little while everything seemed perfect. We had our own little family, hidden away from the world." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, and Joseph found himself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite himself. "But they found us," Medima continued, her voice hardening. "Your commander, Oswin. He came with his hunting party, and they surrounded our shelter. David went out to talk to them, to try to reason with them. He thought because he was human, they would listen to him." Joseph felt ice forming in his stomach because he knew where this story was going. "Oswin shot him," Medima said, her voice now flat and emotionless in the way that people use when talking about trauma too great to fully process. "He called David a race traitor, said he had betrayed his own species by loving me, and then he shot him in the back while he was trying to run back to us." She turned her huge eyes to Joseph, and he saw in them a depth of pain and loss that made his own traumas seem small by comparison. "Lindali saw everything," Medima whispered. She was 4 years old and she watched your commander murder her father in cold blood. She has not spoken more than a few words since that day, until today, when she found you." Joseph felt like he had been punched in the gut. He looked over at Lindley, this tiny brave creature who had overcome her terror to save her mother, and he saw her in a completely new light. She was not just a frightened child, she was a survivor of atrocities that would have broken most adults. "I am sorry," Joseph said, and the words felt laughably inadequate. "I am so sorry for what he did, for what we all did." "Why?" Medema asked, fixing him with that intense stare again. "Why are you sorry? You did not pull the trigger?" "No," Joseph agreed, "but I served under him. I followed his orders. I was part of the system that made men like him possible. That makes me complicit, whether I want to admit it or not." He took a shuddering breath and spoke words he had not said aloud to anyone, barely admitted to himself in the dark watches of the night. "I was there that day," he said quietly. "Not at your shelter, but at another one just like it. Oswin ordered us to clear it out, said it was a weapons cache. But when we breached the door, there were no weapons. Just families, children, old people, and he ordered us to kill them all anyway." Joseph's hands were shaking now, the memories flooding back with crystal clarity despite all his efforts to suppress them. "I refuse," he continued. "I threw down my weapon and told him I would not do it, and he looked at me like I was something he had scraped off his boot and said that I was weak, that I did not deserve to wear the uniform. The other men in the unit followed his orders. They killed everyone in that shelter while I stood outside and did nothing to stop them." "You would have died," Medema said, and there was no judgment in her voice, just simple statement of fact. "I know," Joseph replied, "and I tell myself that every day, that there was nothing I could have done, that getting myself killed would not have saved them. But I also know that I made a choice that day to save myself instead of standing up for what was right, and I have been running from that choice ever since." Silence filled the cave, broken only by the rain outside and Lindali's soft breathing. Medema reached out with her good hand and placed it on Joseph's arm, her touch surprisingly warm despite the coolness of her skin. "But you are not running anymore," she said. "You came when my daughter called for help. You saved us when you could have walked away. That choice matters too." Joseph wanted to believe her, wanted to let that absolution wash away some of the guilt that had been eating at him for 3 years. But he knew it was not that simple. One good deed did not erase a lifetime of bad ones. All he could do was try to do better, to be better, and hope that it was enough. The rain finally began to ease as evening approached, the downpour fading to a steady drizzle, and then to nothing. Joseph stood at the mouth of the cave and looked out at the jungle, his trained eyes scanning for movement or any sign of pursuit. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. They needed to move soon. Every hour they stayed in one place was an hour that Oswin and his men could use to close the distance. But Joseph was exhausted, and Medema was in no condition to travel, and pushing forward into the night would be suicide with the predators that prowled the darkness. He was still weighing his options when he heard it. The snap of a branch, too loud and too deliberate to be an animal. Joseph's hand went to his rifle instantly, his body dropping into a combat crouch as he scanned the darkening forest below the cave entrance. There, movement in the shadows, maybe 50 meters out, multiple contacts moving with the careful deliberation of trained soldiers conducting a search. They had been found. Joseph's mind raced through options and discarded them just as quickly. They could not run, not with Medema in her condition. They could not hide because the cave had only one entrance, and they would be trapped, which left fighting, and Joseph knew that was a losing proposition against multiple opponents with superior position and firepower. Unless he could even the odds somehow. He turned back to where Medema and Lindali waited in the darkness of the cave and spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "They are here, maybe 4 or 5 of them, coming up the slope. I am going to try to slow them down, buy us some time. You stay here and stay quiet. If something happens to me, if you hear gunfire, you take Lindali and you run. Do you understand?" Medema started to protest, but Joseph cut her off with a sharp gesture. "This is not negotiable. Your daughter needs you alive more than I do. Promise me you will run." After a long moment, Medima nodded reluctantly. Joseph checked his rifle one last time, counting the rounds he had left. 8 bullets. Not nearly enough. He would have to make every shot count and hope that it was sufficient. He slipped out of the cave and began working his way down the slope, moving with practiced silence. His eyes had adjusted to the growing darkness, and he could see the soldiers now, 5 of them moving in a standard sweep pattern. He recognized Marcus among them, the sergeant's distinctive bulk unmistakable even in silhouette. Joseph found what he was looking for about halfway down the slope. A massive boulder that was perched precariously on the edge of a small outcropping. Time and erosion had undercut its foundation until it was balanced on just a few contact points. A strong push in the right place, and it would come down like the wrath of an angry god. He moved to the boulder and began examining its base, looking for the critical point where the least force would produce the maximum effect. His hands found what felt like a weak spot in the supporting stone, and he began working at it, using his knife to chip away at the weathered rock. The soldiers were getting closer. He could hear them now, hear Marcus's gruff voice giving orders in a tone that suggested he was bored with this whole exercise. They did not think there was any real danger here. They thought they were just chasing down another frightened native who would be easy prey. Joseph smiled grimly in the darkness and kept working at the stone. When the soldiers were perhaps 20 meters away, close enough that he could have hit them with a thrown rock, Joseph put his shoulder against the boulder and began to push. For a terrible moment, nothing happened, and he thought his plan was going to fail. But then he felt something shift, a subtle change in the way the massive stone was balanced. He pushed harder, throwing all his remaining strength into one final desperate effort. His boots slipped in the mud and he nearly fell, but he caught himself and kept pushing, kept straining against the immovable weight. And then, with a sound like the earth itself groaning, the boulder began to move. It started slowly, rolling almost gently off its perch, but gravity quickly took over and accelerated it to terrifying speed. The massive stone tumbled down the slope, smashing through trees and vegetation with the sound of artillery fire. Smaller rocks and debris came with it, creating a landslide that grew larger with every meter it fell. The soldiers below had perhaps 2 seconds of warning, 2 seconds to process what was happening and try to react. One of them, quicker or luckier than the others, managed to throw himself sideways and avoid the worst of it. 2 more were caught by the edge of the slide and swept off their feet, carried down the slope in a bruising tumble that left them battered but probably alive. The last 2 were not so fortunate. Marcus tried to run, but the ground disappeared beneath his feet and he went down hard, the boulder passing within inches of his head before slamming into a tree with a crack like a gunshot. The tree came down on top of him, and Joseph heard a scream that was abruptly cut off. The final soldier, a young man whose name Joseph did not know, was hit directly by a chunk of stone the size of a small car. There was no scream, no time for fear or pain. He was simply there one moment and gone the next, buried under tons of rock and mud. Joseph did not wait to see the aftermath. He turned and scrambled back up the slope toward the cave, his lungs burning and his legs feeling like they were made of rubber. Behind him, he could hear shouting and confusion as the survivors tried to regroup and figure out what had just happened. He reached the cave entrance and practically fell inside, his chest heaving. "Time to go," he gasped out. "Right now." He gathered up Medima again, ignoring her protests and the screaming pain in his shoulders and back. Linda Lee was already moving, her small face set in grim determination. They had used up their margin of safety and then some. Now it was time to run and hope they could reach sanctuary before Oswin caught up with them. They emerged from the cave into the deepening twilight and began making their way along a narrow ledge that ran along the face of the cliff. Below them, perhaps 100 meters down, Joseph could hear the roar of a river that he could not see through the darkness and mist. One wrong step would send them all tumbling to their deaths. "Look at my feet," Joseph called back to Linda Lee. "Just my feet. Do not look down." The little girl nodded and fixed her eyes on Joseph's boots, matching her steps to his as they inched their way along the treacherous path. The stone was slick with moisture and covered in loose gravel that shifted under their weight. Several times Joseph felt his foot begin to slide and had to press himself flat against the cliff face to keep from falling. Medima had gone limp in his arms, either unconscious again or simply conserving her strength. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, and Joseph knew she was running out of time. They needed to reach that settlement soon or none of this would matter. They had been on the ledge for perhaps 10 minutes when disaster struck. A section of the path ahead simply gave way without warning, the stone crumbling under its own weight and cascading down into the darkness below. The gap was perhaps 2 meters wide, narrow enough to jump under normal circumstances, but an impossible chasm when you were carrying an injured woman and trying to shepherd a small child. Joseph stared at the gap and felt despair settling over him like a heavy blanket. They were so close. They had come so far and overcome so much. But this might be where their luck finally ran out. He was still standing there, paralyzed by indecision, when Lindley tugged on his belt again. He looked down at her and saw that she was pointing at something. He followed her gaze and saw what he had missed in the darkness. A thin chimney-like crack that ran up the face of the cliff, bypassing the collapsed section of ledge entirely. It was barely wide enough for a human to fit through, and climbing it would require leaving Medema behind. But there was no other option. "Can you climb?" he asked Lindley, and the little girl nodded confidently. Joseph looked at the crack again and made his decision. He could not climb and carry Medema at the same time, but maybe, just maybe, he could push her up ahead of him while he climbed below. It was insane. It was probably impossible, but it was the only chance they had. He positioned Medema carefully at the base of the crack, wedging her into the narrow opening so she was supported by the stone on either side. Then he squeezed in below her, bracing his back against one wall and his feet against the other in a technique called stemming that he had learned during mountain warfare training a lifetime ago. "Lindali," he called down, "I need you to push your mother's feet from below while I pull from above. Can you do that?" The little girl nodded and scrambled into position. What followed was perhaps the most exhausting 15 minutes of Joseph's life. He would brace himself in the crack and reach up to grab Medema under the arms, then pull with all his strength while Lindley pushed from below. They would gain perhaps half a meter with each effort, and then Joseph would have to reposition himself and do it all over again. His arms were on fire, his legs were cramping. His back felt like someone was driving red-hot spikes into his spine with every movement. Sweat poured into his eyes and mixed with blood from a dozen small cuts where the rough stone had scraped his skin raw. But slowly, agonizingly, they made progress. The top of the crack grew closer with each rep, until finally Joseph's groping hand found purchase on solid ground. With one final supreme effort, he dragged himself and Medema up and over the edge, collapsing onto blessedly flat ground. Lindley scrambled up behind them a moment later, moving with the agility of a mountain goat. She looked down at Joseph's exhausted form with something that might have been awe or might have been simple concern for his sanity. Joseph lay there for several minutes, too tired to even think about moving. Every part of his body hurt in ways he had not known were possible. He was fairly certain he had torn something important in his back, and his hands were bleeding again, and he was pretty sure at least one of his ribs was cracked from where he had been grinding against the stone. But they had made it. Against all odds and all logic, they had made it. Eventually, because there was no other choice, Joseph forced himself to stand. He lifted Medema once more and began walking into the darkness, following Lindley's small form as she led them deeper into the mountains. The hours that followed became a blur of pain and exhaustion and the simple mechanical process of putting one foot in front of the other. Joseph stopped thinking, stopped feeling, stopped being anything more than a biological machine that existed only to carry its burden forward. His world narrowed to the patch of ground immediately in front of his feet and the small blue figure just ahead that represented the only navigation he had. Dawn found them in a narrow valley where the mist hung thick enough to cut with a knife. Joseph's legs were shaking so badly he could barely walk. He had passed beyond exhaustion into some strange twilight state where his body continued to function, despite having every reason to simply shut down. Lindley had slowed as well, her small form stumbling with increasing frequency. She was running on nothing but willpower and the desperate need to save her mother. Joseph knew that feeling intimately. The sun was fully up when they finally saw it, a narrow cleft between two massive stone pillars that looked like the work of some ancient and unknowable architect. The gap was so narrow it was almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. and it was partially obscured by hanging vines and creeping vegetation. Lindley led them through the gap and into a passage that wound through solid rock for perhaps 50 meters. The stone walls pressed in from both sides, barely wide enough for Joseph to pass through sideways. He felt a moment of claustrophobic panic before they emerged into sunlight again and found themselves in another world entirely. The hidden valley spread out before them like something from a dream. It was perhaps 2 kilometers across, ringed by cliffs so high and so sheer that Joseph could not see their tops through the morning mist. The valley floor was covered in vegetation that looked similar to the jungle outside, but subtly different, as if this place had evolved in isolation for millennia. The trees here were massive beyond anything Joseph had seen, their trunks wider than buildings, and their branches forming a canopy so dense that the ground below was cast in perpetual twilight. The RI had built their homes not in the trees, but from the trees, shaping the living wood into structures that seemed to grow organically from trunk and branch. Bridges of woven vine and living root connected the various levels of the settlement, creating a 3-dimensional city that made use of every centimeter of vertical space. Joseph could see figures moving along the bridges, going about their daily business in this hidden sanctuary. They had been spotted. Joseph watched as several RI warriors emerged from concealment, moving with the fluid grace of their species. They were armed with spears and bows, weapons that looked primitive, but were probably far more effective than his rifle in their hands. The warriors surrounded them, weapons raised, and Joseph carefully lowered Madima to the ground. He raised his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace, though he kept his body positioned between the warriors and his 2 charges. One of the warriors, an older male with elaborate bioluminescent patterns on his skin, stepped forward and began speaking rapidly in the RI language. Joseph had picked up a few words during his time in the jungle, but not nearly enough to follow this particular conversation. Madima responded weakly, her voice barely audible. She spoke for perhaps 30 seconds before her strength gave out, and she slumped back against Joseph's leg. Whatever she said seemed to have an effect, because the warriors' postures relaxed slightly, and several of them lowered their weapons. The older warrior looked at Joseph for a long moment, his large eyes unreadable. Then he turned and barked orders to the others, and suddenly there was movement everywhere. Several female RI came running with what looked like a stretcher woven from broad leaves and flexible branches. They lifted Madima carefully onto the stretcher and began carrying her away toward one of the larger tree structures. Lindley started to follow but stopped and looked back at Joseph, clearly torn between staying with her mother and staying with the human who had saved them. "Go," Joseph said quietly. "She needs you more than I do right now." Lindley hesitated for just a moment longer, then ran after the stretcher and disappeared into the settlement. Joseph watched her go and felt an unexpected pang of loss. In just a few hours, this small creature had somehow worked her way past all his carefully constructed defenses and found the part of him that still knew how to care about someone other than himself. The older warrior was still watching him with that unreadable expression. Joseph met his gaze steadily, waiting to see what would happen next. He was too tired to run and too tired to fight, so whatever came next would simply have to come. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, the warrior nodded slowly. He gestured for Joseph to follow and began walking toward the settlement. Joseph hesitated, wondering if this was a trick, but then decided that he had come too far and risked too much to turn back now. He followed the warrior into the heart of the ROI sanctuary, aware of the many eyes watching him from the shadows. He was the enemy here, or at least he should have been. He wore the uniform of the humans who had hunted these people almost to extinction. He carried weapons that had probably killed friends and family members of everyone he saw, but he had also saved one of their own. And perhaps, just perhaps, that meant something. The warrior led him to a circular platform near the center of the settlement, a space that seemed to serve as some kind of community gathering place. Several older RI were already there, sitting in a loose circle. Elders, Joseph realized. He was being brought before some kind of council. The older warrior spoke rapidly in his own language, gesturing occasionally at Joseph. The elders listened in silence, their faces giving away nothing of their thoughts. When the warrior finished speaking, One of the elders, a female with silver patterns on her dark blue skin, leaned forward and spoke directly to Joseph in surprisingly good human speech. You bring Medema and her child to us. You save them from trap, carry them far. Why? Her voice was gentle, but there was steel underneath, a demand for truth. Joseph thought about lying, about giving them some noble reason that would make him look heroic. But he was too tired for games, and these people deserved better than more lies from humans. Because they needed help, he said simply, and because I am tired of being part of the problem. The elder studied him for a long moment, her huge eyes seeming to look straight through to his soul. Then she spoke again. You are deserter, traitor to your kind. This we know. We hear stories of human soldier who turns back on killing, who helps those he was ordered to hunt. You are this one? Joseph nodded slowly. There was no point in denying it. I was part of Captain Oswin's unit. I served under him for 5 years, carried out his orders, did things I am not proud of. But I am not that person anymore. Or at least, I am trying not to be. Trying is not same as being, the elder said. Words are easy. Actions are truth. You save Medema. You risk life for stranger. This is good action. But one action does not erase all previous actions. You understand this? I do, Joseph replied. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am not even sure I deserve to be forgiven. I just want to do better, to be better. The elders conferred among themselves in low voices, speaking too quickly in their own language for Joseph to have any hope of following. He stood there and waited, swaying slightly on his feet from exhaustion. His vision was starting to blur at the edges, and he knew he was close to collapse. Finally, the silver-patterned elder spoke again. We grant you sanctuary. You may stay in valley until Medema is healed. After that, you choose, leave or stay. But know this, human, if you stay as one of us. You follow our ways, you help our community. And if you ever raise weapon against one of our people, you die. These are terms. You agree? Joseph did not even have to think about it. Where else did he have to go? What else did he have left? I agree, he said. The elder nodded, seemingly satisfied. She gestured to one of the younger warriors who stepped forward and placed a hand on Joseph's shoulder. The touch was surprisingly gentle. Come, the warrior said in halting human speech. You need rest, need food, need healing. We provide. Joseph followed the warrior to a small dwelling that had been carved from a massive tree root. Inside was simple but comfortable. Woven mats on the floor, a small fire pit, water stored in what looked like giant seed pods. The warrior gestured for him to sit, then left without another word. Joseph carefully removed his weapons and gear, laying them aside with hands that shook from exhaustion. Then he collapsed onto one of the mats and felt consciousness leaving him like water draining from a sink. His last thought before sleep claimed him was of a small blue hand gripping his pants leg, pulling him toward hope. He slept for 18 hours straight, a deep, dreamless sleep that his body desperately needed. When he finally woke, the sun was setting again, and his entire body felt like one giant bruise. But he was alive, and from somewhere nearby he could hear the sound of children laughing. That sound, more than anything else, told him he had made the right choice. Over the next several days, Joseph slowly began to find his place in the community. It was not easy. Many of the RI regarded him with suspicion and fear, and he could not blame them for it. He had to prove himself through actions, not words, and he threw himself into that task with the same intensity he had once brought to military operations. He helped with repairs to dwellings damaged by storms. He used his knowledge of human tactics to help improve the settlement's defenses. He taught some of the warriors how to set traps and early warning systems. He worked until his body ached and his hands bled, trying to make up for just a fraction of the harm his kind had done. But most importantly, he visited Medema and Lindali every day. The healers had managed to save Medema's leg, though she would walk with a limp for the rest of her life. The infection had been fought back with herbal remedies that Joseph did not understand, but could not argue with given the results. She was weak and in pain, but she was alive and improving steadily. Lindali had barely left her mother's side, except for brief trips to find Joseph and drag him to their dwelling. The little girl had apparently decided that Joseph belonged to her now, and she was not shy about expressing that ownership. She would climb into his lap and fall asleep while he and Madima talked, her small warm weight a constant reminder of what he was fighting for. They talked about many things during those visits, about the war and the pointless brutality of it, about the colony, that had started with such high hopes and devolved into genocide, about David and the life he and Madima had tried to build together, about the future and whether such a thing even existed for any of them. It was during one of these conversations that Madima told him about Oswin's continued pursuit. "He will not stop," she said quietly. "You know this, yes? He sees your desertion as personal betrayal. He will hunt you until one of you is dead." Joseph nodded grimly. He had known this was coming, had been waiting for it really. Oswin was nothing if not persistent, and Joseph had humiliated him twice now, once by deserting and again by surviving. "Let him come," Joseph said. "I am done running." "You cannot fight him alone," Madima insisted. "He has entire squad, maybe more by now. You have rifle with few bullets and knife. This is not equal fight." "No," Joseph agreed, "but I will not bring your people into my war. They have suffered enough because of humans. I will face Oswin alone when the time comes." Madima reached out and took his hand, her cool four-fingered grip surprisingly strong. "You are one of us now," she said firmly. "This is not your war alone anymore. We all fight for survival. We all fight for future. Together." Joseph wanted to argue, wanted to keep his personal demons separate from these people who had shown him more kindness than he deserved. But he could see the determination in Madima's eyes and knew that arguing would be pointless. "Together then," he said softly. It was 3 weeks later when Oswin finally found them. The settlement sentries brought word that human soldiers had been spotted in the outer valleys, moving in a pattern that suggested they were conducting a systematic search. It was only a matter of time before they found the hidden entrance. The Council of Elders met to discuss their options. They could flee, abandon the sanctuary they had built, and find some other place to hide. But where would they go? This valley was already the most remote and defensible location within hundreds of kilometers. Running would only delay the inevitable, or they could fight. Use their knowledge of the terrain and their superior numbers to drive the humans back. But fighting meant casualties, and the RI had already lost so many. Joseph listened to the debate with growing frustration until finally he could stay silent no longer. "Let me go to him," he said, standing up to address the council. "Let me face Oswin alone. Maybe I can talk to him, make him see reason, or maybe I can buy you enough time to prepare proper defenses. Either way, it keeps you out of the immediate line of fire." The silver-patterned elder shook her head slowly. "This is noble offer, but foolish. He will kill you on sight, or worse, capture you and use you as bait to draw us out." "Maybe," Joseph agreed, "but I have to try. I owe you that much. I owe all of you that much." The debate continued for another hour, but Joseph had already made up his mind. He would go out to meet Oswin, would try one last time to reach the man who had once been his friend. And if that failed, well, at least he would die trying to do the right thing instead of running from it. As the sun rose the next morning, Joseph checked his weapons one final time and prepared to leave. He was saying goodbye to Madima and Lindley when the little girl suddenly threw her arms around his waist and would not let go. He tried to gently pry her loose, but she clung to him with the desperate strength of a child who had already lost too much. "Do not leave," she whispered in halting human speech. It was the first time he had heard her speak more than a word or two. "Please, stay." Joseph felt something break inside his chest. He knelt down so he was at eye level with the child and gently cupped her face in his hands. "I have to go," he said softly, "but I promise I will come back. Can you be brave for me until then?" Lindley stared at him with those huge eyes for a long moment, then slowly nodded. She released her grip on his waist but immediately took his hand instead, as if maintaining physical contact was the only thing keeping him real. Joseph looked over her head at Madima and saw that the woman's eyes were shining with unshed tears. She nodded once, a gesture that might have been approval or might have been farewell. He nodded back and then, very gently, disengaged his hand from Lindali's grip. He walked out of the settlement alone, leaving his family behind. The word surprised him when it appeared in his thoughts, but he realized it was accurate. Somewhere along the way, these two blue-skinned aliens had become his family in a way that transcended biology or species. They were the people he would die to protect. And if that meant facing down his own personal demon, then so be it. He found Oswin exactly where he expected to, at the narrow entrance to the hidden valley, studying the stone pillars with the calculating eye of a tactician. The captain was alone, which told Joseph this was about to become personal. "Hello, Oswin," Joseph called out, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. The captain turned slowly, a smile spreading across his face that did not reach his eyes. "Joseph," he said pleasantly, "I was wondering when you would finally show yourself. Save me the trouble of having to flush you out." "You do not want to do this," Joseph said carefully. "There are women and children in that valley, innocent people who have never hurt anyone. Let them be." Oswin laughed, a sharp barking sound with no humor in it. "Innocent? There are no innocent aliens, Joseph. You of all people should know that. They are a disease, a contamination that needs to be eradicated before they can spread." "They are people," Joseph said firmly, "just like us. They love and laugh and feel pain and want to live. How does killing them make us anything other than murderers?" "It makes us survivors," Oswin shot back. "This is their world. Joseph, we are the invaders here. And when you are outnumbered and surrounded by potential enemies, you do not wait for them to strike first. You strike first, and you strike hard, and you do not stop until the threat is eliminated." Joseph shook his head sadly. "When did you become this? When did the man I knew, the man who taught me about honor and duty, turn into someone who murders children in cold blood?" For just a moment, something flickered in Oswin's eyes. Pain, perhaps, or the ghost of the man he used to be. But it was gone so quickly Joseph almost thought he had imagined it. "I became what I needed to become to survive," Oswin said coldly. "You could have done the same, could have been right here beside me, helping to secure humanity's future on this world. But you threw it all away for what? For some alien woman and her half-breed brat?" Joseph felt his hands curl into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I threw it away because I remembered what it meant to be human. Real human, not the twisted version you have become. Humanity is supposed to mean something, Oswin. It is supposed to be about more than just survival at any cost." "Pretty word," Oswin sneered. "But words do not win wars. Actions do. And my actions are going to ensure that humans remain the dominant species on this planet." He raised his weapon, and Joseph saw his death in those cold eyes. But before Oswin could pull the trigger, a voice rang out from above. "You will not hurt him." Both men looked up to see Madima standing on the cliff edge above them, supported by two RI warriors. Her injured leg was still bandaged, but she was standing on her own, and in her hands was a bow with an arrow nocked and drawn. "This is not your fight, alien," Oswin called up to her. "This is between me and the traitor." "Wrong," Madima replied. "He saved my life, saved my daughter's life. By law of my people, his enemies are my enemies. His battles are my battles. You want to kill him, you must go through me first." Joseph wanted to tell her to go back, to get to safety, but he knew it would be pointless. She had made her choice just as he had made his. Oswin looked at the RI woman on the cliff, and then back at Joseph, his expression calculating. He was probably weighing his odds, trying to decide if he could take out both of them before reinforcements arrived. "This is not over," Oswin said finally, lowering his weapon slightly. "I will be back, with more men, more weapons. And when I come, I will burn that valley to ashes and everyone in it." He turned and walked away, his back straight and his movements controlled. But Joseph had seen the slight tremor in his hands and the way his jaw was clenched so tight the muscles stood out like cords. Oswin was afraid, not of death, but of failure, of losing control, of being proven wrong. And that made him more dangerous than ever. Joseph watched until his former commander disappeared into the jungle, then turned and made his way back into the valley. Madima was waiting for him at the entrance, leaning heavily on her walking stick, but smiling despite the obvious pain. "That was foolish," Joseph said without heat. "You should not have followed me." "Someone had to make sure you did not do something stupid and heroic," Madima replied. "Besides, I owed you." "You do not owe me anything," Joseph insisted. Yes, I do, she said firmly. You gave me my life back. You gave Lindali her mother back. That is debt that can never fully be repaid. But I can try. She reached out and took his hand, and together they walked back into the valley, back to their home. Because that was what it was now, Joseph realized. This place and these people had become his home in a way that no military base or human settlement ever had. He was home, but Oswin's threat hung over the valley like a storm cloud that refused to break. Joseph knew the captain well enough to know that his words were not empty posturing. He would return, and when he did, he would bring death with him. The council met again that evening, this time with Joseph present as a full participant rather than a supplicant. The atmosphere was tense, the elders speaking in hushed tones as they debated their options. Joseph listened carefully, using the limited RI vocabulary he had picked up to follow the general flow of the conversation. Finally, the silver-patterned elder turned to him and spoke in human language. You know this Oswin better than any of us. You served with him, fought beside him. Tell us true. Can he be reasoned with? Can he be turned aside from this path? Joseph thought carefully before answering. He owed these people honesty, even if the truth was ugly. 5 years ago, I would have said yes. The man I knew then believed in rules and honor, in protecting the innocent, even when it was difficult. But that man is gone, replaced by something colder and more ruthless. The Oswin who is hunting us now does not see you as people. He sees you as obstacles to be removed, problems to be solved, and he is very, very good at solving problems. Then we must prepare for war, said one of the younger warriors, a male named Kale, who had been among those who first greeted Joseph at the valley entrance. We fortify the passage, set traps, station our best fighters at the choke points. Let them come. We will turn their own tactics against them. No, Joseph said firmly. That is exactly what Oswin wants. He excels at siege warfare, at grinding down defenders through attrition and superior firepower. If we try to hold the entrance, he will simply pin us there and starve us out or smoke us out or find some other way to break us. Then what do you suggest? Asked another elder, an ancient male whose patterns had faded to pale silver with age. We cannot run and we cannot fight. What other option remains? Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his mind working through scenarios and possibilities. There had to be a way, some angle he was not seeing. And then it came to him, a plan so audacious and so dangerous that he almost dismissed it out of hand. But the more he thought about it, the more it made a terrible kind of sense. We take the fight to him, Joseph said slowly, before he can organize a proper assault, before he can bring in reinforcements and heavy weapons. We hit his base camp, destroy his supplies, scatter his forces, make it too costly for him to continue the hunt. The elders stared at him in shocked silence. Finally, the silver-patterned elder spoke. You suggest we attack humans in their own territory? This is madness. We are hunters and gatherers, not soldiers. We do not have weapons that can match theirs. You do not need to match their weapons, Joseph countered. You need to use the advantages you have. You know this terrain better than any human ever could. You can move through the jungle in complete silence. You can see in low light and hear sounds that human ears miss. Those are force multipliers that outweigh any technological advantage they might have. And you would lead this attack? Kyle asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. You would take us into battle against your own people? They stopped being my people the day Oswin murdered an unarmed man in front of his child, Joseph said coldly. I will lead you, yes, but only if the council agrees that this is the right course of action. I will not force you into a war you do not want. The debate that followed was intense and prolonged, with arguments flying back and forth in rapid-fire RI that Joseph could not hope to follow. But he understood the body language, the way factions were forming and positions hardening. Some wanted to fight, others wanted to flee, and still others wanted to simply wait and hope that Oswin would give up and go away. Eventually a vote was called. It was close, closer than Joseph would have liked, but the final decision was made. They would raid the human base camp, strike hard and fast, and then disappear back into the jungle before a counterattack could be organized. They had 3 days to prepare. Joseph threw himself into the task with the focused intensity of a man who knew that failure meant death for everyone he cared about. He began by assessing what resources they had to work with. The RI hunters carried bows that were far more powerful than they looked, capable of punching through light armor at close range. Their spears were tipped with a local mineral that held an edge better than steel and was nearly impossible to break. But weapons alone would not be enough. They needed tactics, coordination, and most importantly, they needed intelligence about the enemy's dispositions and capabilities. That meant reconnaissance, and Joseph was the only one who could do it without being shot on sight. He left the valley before dawn on the second day, moving through the jungle with the cautious stealth of a man who knew that one mistake would be his last. The journey to the human base camp took 6 hours of careful travel, avoiding patrols and staying well clear of any established trails. The camp itself was exactly what Joseph had expected, a fortified position with overlapping fields of fire, regular patrols, and enough firepower to hold off a frontal assault by a force 10 times their size. Oswin had not been idle. He had called in reinforcements from other units, and Joseph counted at least 20 soldiers in the compound. But as he watched from his concealed position in the trees, Joseph began to notice weaknesses in their setup. The sentries followed predictable patterns, checking the same spots at the same intervals. The fuel depot was positioned too close to the ammunition stores, a violation of basic safety protocols that would never have been allowed under normal circumstances. And the perimeter wire was incomplete on the eastern side, probably because they had run out of material and were waiting for a resupply. Joseph committed every detail to memory, building a mental map of the camp and its defenses. He stayed in position for 8 hours, barely moving, until he was certain he had extracted every useful piece of information. Then he began the long journey back to the valley. He arrived just after nightfall, exhausted and hungry, but carrying intelligence that would make all the difference. He spread out a rough map he had drawn on a piece of bark and began briefing the raid team. "We hit them 2 hours before dawn," he explained, pointing to various positions on the map. "That is when human alertness is at its lowest point. We will split into 3 groups. The first group, led by Kyle, will create a diversion at the northern perimeter. Nothing too aggressive, just enough to draw attention and pull some of the sentries out of position." Kyle nodded, his expression serious. "The second group, led by me, will infiltrate from the east through the gap in the wire. Our objective is the fuel depot. We plant incendiary devices, set timers, and extract before they blow. The explosion will create chaos and hopefully trigger secondary detonations in the ammo stores." "And the third group?" asked one of the warriors. "The third group stays in reserve," Joseph said. "If something goes wrong, if we need rescue or covering fire, they move in, but only as a last resort. The goal is to get in, do the damage, and get out without anyone even knowing we were there, until it is too late." They spent the rest of the night rehearsing the plan, going over every possible contingency and developing signals for communication in the field. Joseph was impressed by how quickly the RI adapted to military thinking. They might not have formal training, but they had survival instincts that had been honed by generations of living in a hostile environment. As the others finally dispersed to get what rest they could before the raid, Joseph found himself unable to sleep. He sat at the entrance to his dwelling, staring out at the bioluminescent patterns that the RI plants created in the darkness. They were beautiful, these lights that served no purpose except to exist and be lovely. So different from the harsh utility of human technology. He heard soft footsteps behind him and turned to find Madima approaching, moving slowly but with increasing confidence on her healing leg. She settled down beside him with a soft sigh. "You should be resting," she said quietly. "Tomorrow will be dangerous." "I know," Joseph replied, "but my mind will not stop working through scenarios. What if we are discovered too early? What if the charges do not detonate? What if Oswin is waiting for us?" "Then you adapt," Madima said simply. "You taught me this, remember? In the jungle when the trap had me, you could have frozen, could have given up. But you looked at the problem and found a solution. You will do the same tomorrow." Joseph managed a weak smile. "You have a lot of faith in me. I am not sure I have earned it." "You earned it when you chose to help a stranger instead of saving yourself," Madima said. She reached out and took his hand, her touch warm despite the coolness of her skin. "You earned it every day since, when you have worked to become part of our community. You earned it when you stood between me and Oswin and refused to let him pass. "I am scared," Joseph admitted, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Not of dying. I made peace with that possibility a long time ago. But of failing you, of getting your people killed because I missed something or made a mistake." "Fear is not weakness," Medema said gently. "Fear is what keeps us alive. It makes us careful, makes us think before we act. Only fools feel no fear." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights dance in the darkness. Finally, Medema spoke again. "Lindley asked me today if you were her father now." Joseph felt his chest tighten. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that family is not always about blood, that sometimes the people who matter most are the ones who choose to stay when they could have left." She paused, then continued. "I told her that if she wants you to be her father, she should ask you herself." "I would not know how to be a father," Joseph said quietly. "I have never been responsible for a child before. What if I am terrible at it?" "Then you will learn," Medema said with a slight smile. "The same way all parents learn, by making mistakes and trying to do better next time. But I do not think you will be terrible at it. You already protect her as if she were your own. You already care for her well-being above your own. That is what being a parent means." Joseph thought about Lindley, about her small hand gripping his with desperate trust, about the way she would fall asleep in his lap while he and Medema talked, about how she had started smiling again, something Medema said she had not done since her father was killed. "If she asks," Joseph said slowly, "I will say yes, if that is what she wants." Medema squeezed his hand. "It is what she wants, and I think it is what you want too, even if you are afraid to admit it." She stood carefully, testing her leg. "Get some rest, Joseph. Your daughter needs you to come back safely tomorrow." She left him sitting there in the darkness, his mind reeling from the weight of what she had just implied. Not just that Lindley might see him as a father, but that Medema herself was welcoming him into their family unit. The implications of that were both terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. But that was a problem for another day. Right now, he had a raid to prepare for, and people depending on him to get it right. The raid team assembled in the pre-dawn darkness, their faces painted with mud and ash to break up their distinctive patterns. They carried minimal gear, just weapons and the incendiary charges that Joseph had jury-rigged from materials he had found in the settlement. The charges were crude but effective, basically just containers of flammable liquid with improvised fuses. Joseph went over the plan one final time, making sure everyone understood their role and their fallback positions. Then he looked at each warrior in turn, trying to convey confidence he did not entirely feel. "Remember," he said quietly, "we are not trying to win a battle here. We are trying to send a message. We are telling Oswin and anyone else who might be thinking about attacking this valley that we are not helpless victims, that we will fight back and we will make it hurt. Do your jobs, follow the plan, and we will all be home in time for breakfast." They moved out in single file, Cale's diversion team splitting off to the north, while Joseph led his assault team toward the eastern approach. The jungle was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, providing natural cover for any noise they might make. But the RI moved with such perfect silence that Joseph felt clumsy and loud by comparison, despite all his training. They reached the perimeter wire exactly on schedule. Joseph knelt and examined the gap he had noted during his reconnaissance, relieved to find it unchanged. One by one, the assault team slipped through and into the compound proper. The fuel depot was a simple structure, basically just a reinforced tent covering a dozen barrels of high-octane fuel. 2 sentries were supposed to be watching it, but Joseph could see that they had drifted away from their posts, probably to share a cigarette or simply to stay awake through the boring hours of the night watch. Joseph signaled for his team to hold position while he crept forward, moving from shadow to shadow. He reached the first barrel and carefully placed his improvised charge, setting the timer for 5 minutes. That would give them enough time to plant the remaining devices and clear the area before everything went up. He had just placed the second charge when he heard a voice behind him. Well, look, what we have here." Joseph turned slowly to find himself staring down the barrel of a rifle held by a soldier he did not recognize. The man was young, probably fresh out of basic training, and his hands were shaking slightly. nervous but committed to doing his duty. "Do not move," the soldier said, his voice cracking slightly. "Put your hands up and step away from the barrels." Joseph complied slowly, his mind racing. If he raised an alarm, the entire raid would be compromised. But if he tried to fight, the sound of gunfire would accomplish the same thing. He needed a third option, and he needed it fast. "Easy there, soldier," Joseph said in his most calming voice. "No need for anyone to get hurt here. I am not armed. See?" He held up his hands, showing they were empty. The soldier's eyes flicked down for just a second to verify this, and that was all the opening Joseph needed. He lunged forward, grabbing the rifle barrel and twisting it up and away, while simultaneously driving his shoulder into the soldier's midsection. They went down in a tangle of limbs, fighting for control of the weapon. The soldier was young and strong, but Joseph had years of combat experience and the desperate strength of a man fighting for the lives of everyone he loved. He got his forearm across the soldier's throat and applied pressure until the younger man's struggles weakened and then stopped entirely. Joseph held the choke for a few seconds longer than necessary, making sure the soldier was fully unconscious, then carefully lowered him to the ground. He was alive, just out cold. He would wake up in a few minutes with a headache and a story about being ambushed by shadows. But those few minutes were all Joseph needed. He quickly planted the remaining charges, then signaled for his team to withdraw. They slipped back through the gap in the wire just as Cale's diversion team began creating noise on the northern perimeter. Shouts and the sound of weapons fire filled the night as confused soldiers rushed to respond to a threat that was already gone. Joseph and his team had made it perhaps 100 meters into the jungle when the first charge detonated. The explosion was much larger than he had expected, the fuel barrels adding their own energy to the blast. The shockwave knocked him off his feet and sent debris flying in all directions. Secondary explosions followed as the fire spread to the ammunition stores. The entire base camp was lit up like daylight, flames reaching high into the sky. Joseph could hear screaming and the sound of orders being shouted, but it was all chaos and confusion. No organized response, no coordinated counterattack. Just panic. They had done it. Against all odds, they had actually done it. The team regrouped at the pre-designated rally point, and Joseph did a quick head count. Everyone was there. No casualties, no one left behind. Relief flooded through him so strongly that his legs nearly gave out. "Move out," he ordered. "We need to be far away from here before they get organized enough to send out search parties." They traveled through the remainder of the night and into the morning, finally stopping to rest when they were certain they were not being followed. The warriors were in high spirits, laughing and recounting their parts in the raid with the enthusiasm of people who had just proven to themselves that they were not helpless victims. But Joseph could not share their celebration. He knew Oswin too well. This raid would not discourage him. If anything, it would make him more determined, more vicious. They had bought themselves time, but they had also escalated the conflict to a new level. When they finally reached the valley, they were greeted as heroes. The entire community turned out to welcome them back, cheering and singing songs in their musical language. Joseph felt uncomfortable with the attention, but he forced himself to smile and accept their congratulations. Lindley came running through the crowd and launched herself at Joseph with such force that she nearly knocked him over. He caught her automatically, holding her close as she wrapped her small arms around his neck and refused to let go. "You came back," she whispered in his ear, her voice thick with emotion. "I was so scared you would not come back." "I promised, did I not?" Joseph said gently. "And I always keep my promises." The little girl pulled back slightly to look at him, her huge eyes searching his face. "Are you my papa now?" she asked, the question coming out in a rush as if she was afraid to hear the answer. Joseph felt his throat tighten with emotion. He looked over Lindley's head to where Medema stood watching them, saw the hope and fear mixed in her expression. This was a moment that would define the rest of his life, and he knew it. "If you want me to be," he said softly to Lindley, "then yes, I will be your papa, now and always." The smile that lit up the little girl's face was worth every hardship he had endured to reach this moment. She threw her arms around him again, and Joseph held her close, feeling the last of his walls crumbling away. He was not just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for his family, his home, his future. He had finally found something worth living for instead of just reasons to keep from dying. Over the following weeks, the settlement prepared for the inevitable counterattack, but it never came. Reports from scouts indicated that Oswin's unit had been pulled back to the main colony for reassignment. The destruction of their base camp had apparently embarrassed the higher command enough that heads needed to roll, and Oswin had been the most convenient target. It was over. Not permanently, perhaps, but for now the threat had passed. Joseph settled into his new life with a sense of peace he had never known. He worked alongside the other hunters, learning their techniques and sharing his own knowledge. He helped raise Lindley, teaching her to be brave without being reckless, to be kind without being weak. And slowly, carefully, he and Madima built something new between them, a relationship that was equal parts partnership and romance. One evening, as they sat together watching Lindley play with other children in the settlement square, Madima turned to him with a question. Do you regret it? Giving up your old life, your own people, to be here with us? Joseph thought about it for a long moment before answering. I did not give up anything, he said finally. I traded a life of running and hiding and hating myself for a life of purpose and family and belonging. That is not a sacrifice. That is a gift. He reached out and took her hand, intertwining their fingers. You saved me, he said quietly. You and Lindley. Not the other way around. You gave me a reason to be better than I was. A reason to fight for something instead of just against something. I will never be able to repay that. Then do not try, Madima said with a smile. Just be here. Be present. Be the father Lindley needs and the partner I want. That is all the repayment anyone could ask for.